July 24th, 1943, somewhere over the North Sea, 791 British bombers are flying toward Germany in the largest formation ever assembled for a night raid. Inside each aircraft, crew members prepare for what they have been told will be a special mission. They have been briefed on a new device, something they have never used before, something that has been kept secret for nearly 2 years, something so simple it seems absurd. Bundles of paper, strips coated with aluminum foil, each strip precisely 27 centimeters long and 2 centimeters wide, black on one side, metallic on the other, packed in 1-pound bundles and stacked in the bomb bays and flare chutes of every aircraft in the formation. As the bombers approach the German coast, the order comes. The crews begin pushing these bundles through special chutes, one every minute. The strips flutter into the darkness, catching the wind, tumbling and spinning as they fall. From above, they look like nothing at all, just scraps of paper disappearing into the night. But on the ground, inside the concrete bunkers of the German air defense network, something extraordinary is happening. Radar operators stare at their screens in disbelief. Where moments ago there were perhaps a dozen distinct returns indicating incoming bombers, now there are hundreds, thousands. The entire screen fills with false echoes, a blizzard of phantom aircraft that makes it impossible to identify real targets. Searchlights swing wildly across the sky, finding nothing. Anti-aircraft guns fire blindly into empty darkness. Night fighters scramble and circle uselessly, their own radar systems overwhelmed by the same interference. The bomber stream passes over Hamburg almost unopposed. Of the 791 aircraft that took off that night, only 12 failed to return, a loss rate of 1.5%. On previous raids against Hamburg, loss rates had typically exceeded 6%. British intelligence had calculated that without this new device, the raid would have cost approximately 50 aircraft. Instead, more than 35 bombers and their crews returned home, who otherwise would have been shot down over Germany. And all of this was accomplished with nothing more sophisticated than strips of aluminum foil. The device was called Window. It cost almost nothing to manufacture. It required no special training to deploy. A child could understand how it worked. The technology had been available for years, and yet British High Command had refused to authorize its use until that single night in July 1943, even though the delay had cost thousands of bomber crew members their lives. The question that would haunt military historians for decades was simple. Why did Britain wait so long to deploy a weapon so devastatingly effective? The answer reveals one of the strangest paradoxes of the Second World War, a weapon so powerful that both sides independently invented it, so dangerous that both sides were terrified to use it, and so simple that its existence created a stalemate lasting nearly 2 years, during which time thousands of aircraft and tens of thousands of men were lost in battles that need never have been fought. Because the tinfoil strips that blinded German radar over Hamburg were never a secret from the Germans at all. They had invented the exact same technology themselves. To understand why Window remained locked away while British bombers burned over Germany, we must first understand the invisible war that was being fought across the night skies of occupied Europe, a war of radio waves and electronic pulses, a war where victory went not to the side with the most aircraft, but to the side that could see in the dark. The challenge facing Bomber Command in 1941 was existential. Britain's only means of striking directly at Nazi Germany was through strategic bombing. The army would not be ready for a cross-channel invasion for years. The Royal Navy could blockade, but not defeat a continental power. Only the bombers could carry the war to German soil. But carrying the war meant surviving the journey there and back. Early raids were catastrophic failures. Navigation over blacked-out Europe proved nearly impossible. Bomber crews routinely missed entire cities, let alone specific targets. A damning report in August 1941, the Butt Report, revealed that only 1/3 of aircraft claiming to have bombed their targets had actually come within 5 miles of them. On moonless nights over the Ruhr, that figure dropped to 1 in 10. If finding targets was difficult, surviving the journey was worse. German defenses were evolving with frightening speed. By 1941, the German air defense network had evolved into something unprecedented in military history. A continuous barrier of radar stations, night fighter bases, searchlight batteries, and anti-aircraft guns stretching from Denmark to the middle of France. British intelligence called it the Kammhuber Line, after the Luftwaffe general who had designed it. Joseph Kammhuber had built his system around a simple but deadly concept. The night sky over Western Europe was divided into a grid of defensive zones, each approximately 32 kilometers long and 20 kilometers wide. Each zone, called a Himmelbett, contained its own radar stations, searchlights, and assigned night fighters. The system worked with mechanical precision. When British bombers crossed into German-controlled airspace, long-range Freya radar stations detected them from distances of up to 100 kilometers. The Freya was an early warning system, capable of tracking direction and approximate distance, but unable to provide the precise targeting data needed for interception. That task fell to a different radar entirely, the Würzburg. This was a precision tracking system built around a distinctive parabolic dish, approximately 3 meters in diameter. Where the Freya provided general warning, the Würzburg delivered exact coordinates. One Würzburg would lock onto an incoming bomber. A second would track the night fighter assigned to intercept it. Ground controllers watching both signals on plotting tables would radio instructions to the fighter pilot, guiding him through the darkness until his own short-range airborne radar could acquire the target. The combination was devastatingly effective. A British bomber entering a Himmelbett zone faced a gauntlet of interlocking defenses. First, the searchlights, directed by radar, would illuminate the aircraft. Then the anti-aircraft guns, also radar-directed, would open fire. Finally, the night fighter, guided within visual range by ground control, would close for the kill. Even if the bomber escaped one zone, it would immediately enter another. The entire journey to and from any target deep in Germany meant crossing multiple defensive boxes, each with its own deadly combination of radar, guns, and fighters. The toll was catastrophic. During 1942 and early 1943, bomber command loss rates on major raids often exceeded 5% per mission. Simple mathematics revealed the horror behind that statistic. If 5% of bombers were lost on every raid, then after 20 missions, fewer than 40% of a squadron's original aircraft would remain. After 30 missions, fewer than 25%. The average British bomber crew was expected to complete 30 operational flights before being rotated to other duties. Statistically, they had little chance of surviving that tour. Young men were climbing into aircraft, knowing that mathematics condemned them. The bombers kept flying because the strategic calculation demanded it. Britain had no other way to strike directly at German industrial capacity. The army was not yet ready for a cross-channel invasion. The only weapon that could reach German factories was bomber command. So the bombers flew, and the radar tracked them, and the night fighters found them in the darkness, and men died by the thousands over cities they never saw. Into this slaughter stepped a young physicist named Reginald Victor Jones. Jones was 28 years old in the summer of 1940, but he had already made himself indispensable to British intelligence. Working as Deputy Director of Scientific Intelligence, he had unraveled the secret of the German navigation beams, the radio systems that allowed Luftwaffe bombers to strike British cities with precision even through cloud cover. His countermeasures had blunted the effectiveness of the German Blitz, saving countless civilian lives. Winston Churchill trusted him absolutely. As early as 1937, Jones had suggested that pieces of metal foil falling through the air might create false radar echoes. The physics were straightforward. Radar worked by bouncing radio waves off objects and measuring the reflections. Any conductive material of the right size would reflect those waves. If you dropped enough metallic strips through the air, you could create so many false echoes that real targets would become invisible. The idea was not complicated, but proving it required understanding exactly how German radar worked. In February 1942, Jones helped plan one of the most daring commando operations of the war, Operation Biting, also known as the Brunaval Raid. British photo reconnaissance had identified a German radar installation perched on a cliff top near the French village of Brunaval, approximately 12 miles north of Le Havre. The distinctive parabolic dish of a Würzburg radar was visible in aerial photographs. Jones and his colleagues realized this presented an extraordinary opportunity. If commandos could capture components of the radar, British scientists could analyze exactly how it worked and develop countermeasures. The raid was approved at the highest levels. Winston Churchill personally endorsed the plan. Lord Louis Mountbatten, Chief of Combined Operations, oversaw the planning. The task would fall to paratroopers of the newly formed British Airborne Forces, men who had never been tested in combat. On the night of February 27th, 120 men from C Company of the 2nd Parachute Battalion jumped into the darkness over occupied France. Their commander was Major John Frost, who would later become famous for his heroic stand at Arnhem. Landing in snow-covered fields, the paratroopers quickly assembled and moved toward their objective. The raid unfolded with desperate speed. One group secured the beach where Royal Navy landing craft would evacuate them. Another attacked the German garrison. Frost's own team assaulted the radar installation itself, where RAF technician Flight Sergeant Charles Cox dismantled the Würzburg under fire. Cox had been given crash courses in German radar technology and carried specialized tools for his task. Working by flashlight while bullets cracked overhead, he removed critical components including the receiver, transmitter elements, and display unit. The raiders escaped by sea with their prizes, having lost 2 men killed, 8 wounded, and 6 captured. The components they brought back transformed British understanding of German radar capabilities. Scientists now knew the precise frequencies on which German systems operated. They understood the tracking methods. They could calculate exactly what was needed to overwhelm the defenses. The analysis revealed a critical vulnerability. All German radars operated in no more than 3 frequency ranges. This meant a single countermeasure design could potentially jam every radar in the German defensive network. Joan Curran, a Welsh physicist working at the Telecommunications Research Establishment, developed the practical application. Curran was one of the very few female scientists working in British radar research. She had studied at Cambridge University before the war, though Cambridge did not actually award degrees to women until 1948. Despite this institutional barrier, her brilliance had won her a position in one of Britain's most secret research facilities. Curran experimented methodically with various reflective materials. Early concepts included notebook-sized sheets that would double as propaganda leaflets, combining psychological warfare with electronic countermeasures. Various wire configurations were tested. Different metallic coatings were evaluated. Sheets, ribbons, and filaments were dropped from towers and aircraft to study their radar signatures and falling characteristics. The final design was elegant in its simplicity. Strips of black paper backed with aluminum foil, cut to exactly 27 centimeters by 2 centimeters. These dimensions were calculated to resonate at the wavelength of German Würzburg radar, approximately 53 centimeters. A metallic strip, half the wavelength of the target radar, would absorb and re-radiate the maximum amount of energy, creating the strongest possible false echo. The black backing on one side reduced visibility from below, added weight to stabilize their fall, and gave the device its distinctive appearance. The strips were packed in bundles weighing approximately 1 pound each. Dropped from aircraft at bombing altitude, they would flutter slowly earthward over several minutes, tumbling and spinning on air currents, spreading into a diffuse cloud of radar reflections that persisted long enough to mask a bomber formation's passage through a defensive zone. Tests proved the concept worked brilliantly. A single bundle of strips produced radar returns indistinguishable from a heavy bomber. Hundreds of bundles dropped in sequence would create the appearance of a massive aircraft formation on German screens. The defensive radar network would be overwhelmed by phantom targets, while real bombers slipped through undetected. The head of the telecommunications research establishment, AP Rowe, gave the device its code name, Window. By early 1942, Window was ready for operational deployment. It was cheap to manufacture. It was simple to use. It required no modifications to existing aircraft. Every analysis suggested it would dramatically reduce bomber losses, potentially saving thousands of aircrew lives. And yet, British High Command refused to authorize its use. The objection came from an unexpected quarter. Not from those who doubted Window would work, but from those who were certain it would work too well. RAF Fighter Command and Anti-Aircraft Command led the opposition. Their argument was compelling and terrifying. If Britain deployed Window against German radar, the Germans would immediately understand how it worked. They would collect the strips that fell on occupied territory, analyze them, and produce their own version within weeks. Then German bombers would use identical tactics against British radar during raids on English cities. The chain of radar stations that had saved Britain during the Battle of Britain would be blinded. German bombers would strike unopposed. The Blitz would return, worse than before. The argument went all the way to the War Cabinet. On one side stood Bomber Harris, Arthur Harris, the commander-in-chief of Bomber Command. Harris was watching his crews die in unsustainable numbers. He demanded Window to protect them. On the other side stood Fighter Command and Anti-Aircraft Command, responsible for defending British cities. They warned that giving the Germans this weapon could cost more civilian lives than it saved bomber crews. The debate raged through 1942 and into 1943. Jones argued forcefully that the Germans almost certainly already knew about radar jamming using metallic strips. The physics were too obvious to remain secret. Delaying Window deployment was costing lives for no purpose. But Jones faced a formidable opponent. Frederick Lindemann, now Lord Cherwell, was Churchill's personal scientific advisor. Lindemann had been Jones's professor at Oxford. The two men had clashed before on technical matters. Now Lindemann sided with Fighter Command. The risk was too great. Month after month, the stalemate continued. And month after month, bombers fell from the sky over Germany. What British intelligence did not know, what they could not possibly have known, was that the exact same debate was happening inside Nazi Germany. German scientists had independently discovered the same principle. The physics of radar jamming through metallic strips were not difficult. Anyone with a basic understanding of electromagnetic radiation could work out the theory. In laboratories near Berlin, German researchers had developed their own version of aluminum strip radar jamming, which they called Düppel. The name came from the estate in a Berlin suburb where testing had been conducted, though some researchers noted the similarity to the German word for dipole, the technical term for the resonating antenna structure each strip represented. Like window, dupole consisted of metallic strips cut to resonate at radar frequencies. Like window, it was devastatingly effective in tests. German researchers had demonstrated that clouds of falling metallic strips could completely overwhelm Würzburg radar displays. The effect was identical to what British scientists had achieved with window. Like window, it could blind radar systems and render air defenses useless. And like window, it was locked away unused. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, had been briefed on the test results. Despite his frequent boasts and failures, Göring understood immediately what dupole meant. If Germany deployed these strips against British radar during raids on England, the British would collect samples, analyze them, and copy the technique. Then British bombers would use metallic strips against German radar. The Kammhuber Line, which had been claiming British bombers at rates that seemed sustainable for Germany and devastating for Britain, would be neutralized. German cities would burn as British cities had burned during the Blitz. Göring ordered that dupole be kept absolutely secret. The research was classified at the highest levels. Officers who knew of its existence were forbidden to discuss it. The weapon that could have protected German bombers was buried in bureaucratic secrecy to protect German cities from the same weapon in enemy hands. Both sides possessed the same weapon. Both sides were terrified to use it. Both sides kept it secret, paralyzed by the fear that their enemy would learn what their enemy already knew. Meanwhile, aircraft burned and crews died in a war that both sides had the power to transform, but neither dared to change. This mutual paralysis could not last forever. By the spring of 1943, the balance of the air war was shifting in ways that made the original arguments obsolete. The Luftwaffe bomber force, once the terror of Europe, had been bled white by losses in Russia and the Mediterranean. German bombing raids on Britain had dwindled to harassment attacks. The great fleets that had devastated London during the Blitz no longer existed. Even if Germany deployed dupole, there were too few German bombers remaining to exploit it effectively. Simultaneously, bomber command was growing stronger. New 4-engine Lancaster and Halifax bombers were replacing older aircraft. Navigation aids were improving accuracy, but loss rates remained catastrophic. Something had to change. Harris pressed his case with renewed urgency. He pointed out that German bombers were now too few to threaten Britain seriously, while British bomber losses remained unsustainable. The original calculation no longer applied. The time for window had come. The breakthrough came in July 1943. Churchill himself made the final decision. On July 23rd, he authorized the operational use of window for the first time. The target would be Hamburg. Hamburg was Germany's second-largest city and its most important port. The shipyards there had built the battleship Bismarck and continued producing U-boats that were strangling British supply lines across the Atlantic. Blohm and Voss, one of Germany's largest shipbuilders, operated enormous facilities along the waterfront. The city contained oil refineries, aircraft factories, rubber processing plants, and countless smaller industrial facilities supporting the German war effort. 200,000 workers were employed in war-related industries. Perhaps most importantly for navigation purposes, Hamburg sat close to the coast, making it easier to find than inland targets. The distinctive shape of the Elbe River provided unmistakable landmarks for navigators equipped with the new H2S ground mapping radar. Previous raids on Hamburg had been scattered and ineffective. This one would be different. Bomber Command planned a sustained assault lasting multiple days and nights. The RAF would attack by night using its 4-engine Lancaster and Halifax heavy bombers, dropping incendiary and high-explosive bombs on industrial areas and residential districts. The American 8th Air Force would follow up with daylight precision raids using B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator bombers against specific targets such as shipyards and submarine pens. The combined operation was designated with a name drawn from biblical destruction, Operation Gomorrah. In the Old Testament, Gomorrah was one of the cities destroyed by fire from heaven for the wickedness of its inhabitants. The first crews trained to use window were from No. 76 Squadron. 24 crews received special briefings on how to deploy the strips. 1 bundle every minute, pushed through the flare chute using a stopwatch for timing. Too few bundles, and the effect would be insufficient. Too many too quickly, and the bundles might clump together, reducing effectiveness. The rhythm had to be precise. As dusk fell on July 24th, the first bombers began taking off from airfields across eastern England. 791 aircraft formed into a massive stream heading east across the North Sea. Pathfinder squadrons flew ahead to mark the target with colored flares. The main force followed, climbing to bombing altitude, crews checking oxygen systems and testing guns. At the designated point, the order came. Window began falling from the sky. Inside the German radar bunkers, operators watched in confusion as their screens filled with interference. Where they expected to see a bomber stream, they saw chaos. Hundreds of returns multiplying across their displays, impossible numbers of aircraft appearing from nowhere. The carefully calibrated system that had guided night fighters to their kills for 2 years suddenly showed nothing but static and phantoms. The Würzburg radar, so precise in tracking individual targets, was useless. The operators could see returns everywhere, but they could not distinguish bombers from chaff. The Freya early warning radar, operating on different frequencies, was equally blinded. Ground controllers had no useful information to pass to their night fighters. Pilots circling in the darkness received contradictory vectors, sending them toward targets that did not exist. Searchlights swept the sky randomly, their radar directors showing only confusion. Anti-aircraft batteries fired at calculated positions that proved empty. The entire defensive network, refined through years of deadly experience, collapsed in a single night. Meanwhile, the bomber stream flew on, almost unmolested. Over Hamburg, the pathfinders dropped their target indicators. Red and green flares cascaded down, marking the aiming points. Following aircraft released their bomb loads on the markers. High explosive bombs blasted roofs off buildings. Incendiary bombs followed, starting fires in the exposed structures. Wave after wave of bombers added to the destruction. When the last aircraft turned for home, the toll was unprecedented. 12 bombers lost from nearly 800, a loss rate of 1.5% where 6% had been normal. Hamburg's city center was burning. Over 1,500 German civilians were dead in that first night alone. But this was only the beginning. The Americans struck the following afternoon, July 25th, sending over 100 B-17 bombers against the shipyards and industrial targets. Then the RAF returned on the night of the 27th. This second major night raid created something that had never been seen before in aerial warfare. The weather had been exceptionally dry and hot for weeks, part of an unusual summer heat wave affecting northern Europe. The previous bombings had weakened structures throughout the densely built eastern districts of Hamburg. Broken water mains meant fire brigades had difficulty fighting the blazes that had been started. When the incendiaries fell on July 27th, conditions were perfect for catastrophe. 787 bombers attacked that night, concentrating their loads on the Hammerbrook, Ham, and Borgfelder districts east of the city centre. Thousands of individual fires merged into a single conflagration covering several square kilometres. The heat became so intense that it created its own weather system. Superheated air rose at tremendous velocity, reaching temperatures that made the column of smoke and flame visible from aircraft flying 80 kilometres away. The rising air sucked in surrounding atmosphere with hurricane force. Winds of over 150 kilometers per hour tore through the streets, uprooting trees and flinging debris. Temperatures at the center of the firestorm reached 800 degrees Celsius or higher. Asphalt melted and flowed like water. Glass liquefied. Steel beams buckled. People caught in the streets were swept off their feet and drawn toward the flames. Those in basements and shelters suffocated as the fire consumed all available oxygen. Bodies were later found fused to melted asphalt or reduced to ashes. Entire families vanished without trace. The Hamburg Fire Department, already overwhelmed by the earlier raids, could do nothing. Fire brigades from surrounding cities could not approach the inferno. This was a firestorm, the first to be deliberately created through aerial bombardment, a phenomenon so destructive that even those who created it stood horrified at the result. Nothing like it had been seen since the San Francisco earthquake of 1906. The raids continued through early August, with a third major night attack on July 29th and a fourth on August 2nd. By the time Operation Gomorrah concluded, more than 3,000 bomber sorties had been flown. Over 9,000 tons of bombs had fallen on Hamburg, approximately half of them incendiaries. The human cost defied comprehension. Estimates of the death toll varied, but the most accepted figure settled around 37,000 to 42,000 civilians killed, with tens of thousands more wounded. More than half the city's housing had been destroyed, approximately 250,000 dwellings rendered uninhabitable. Over 1 million residents fled the city as refugees, overwhelming surrounding communities and requiring a massive government response to provide food and shelter. Hamburg's industrial capacity was crippled. Nearly 300 important factories were damaged or destroyed. The shipyards that had built U-boats lost months of production. Refineries and rubber plants stood in ruins. The city's contribution to the German war economy dropped precipitously and would not fully recover before the war's end. German Armaments Minister Albert Speer visited the devastation and reported to Adolf Hitler with unusual frankness. If the Allies could repeat this level of destruction against 4 or 5 other major German cities, Speer warned, German war production would collapse completely. He later described the Hamburg raids as a catastrophe that put the German leadership in a state of utmost depression. Hitler himself refused to visit the bombed cities. The ruins spoke too clearly of where the war was heading. Window had made this destruction possible by neutralizing the radar defenses that should have protected the city. The aluminum strips that had seemed so trivial, so absurd, had enabled the most devastating urban destruction ever achieved through aerial bombardment until that time. Only the atomic bombs that would fall on Japan 2 years later would cause comparable destruction in such concentrated attacks. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Now let me explain why this weapon remained hidden for so long, and what that delay truly cost. The standoff over Window reveals a principle that would shape military thinking for the rest of the 20th century. The asymmetry between offensive and defensive use of disruptive technologies. Consider the calculation facing both British and German commanders. If Britain used Window first, Germany would immediately copy it. But the consequences would not be equal. Britain was launching hundreds of bombers against Germany every night. Germany was launching almost none against Britain. Window would save British bomber crews by the hundreds, while threatening perhaps a few dozen additional British civilian casualties from occasional German raids. The original objection from Fighter Command assumed rough parity in offensive capability. When that parity no longer existed, the calculation changed completely. Britain had everything to gain and little to lose. Germany had everything to lose and nothing to gain. Yet the British waited, and during that waiting, men died. The official history is damning. Between early 1942, when Window was ready, and July 1943, when it was finally deployed, Bomber Command lost approximately 11,000 aircrew members killed and 1,600 aircraft destroyed. Not all of these losses would have been prevented by Window. The device was highly effective, but not perfect. German defenses adapted over time, developing new tactics that partially restored their effectiveness. But even conservative estimates suggest that earlier deployment of Window could have saved thousands of lives. These were young men, many barely out of their teens, who climbed into bombers knowing the mathematical certainty of their deaths. They flew mission after mission into defenses that could have been neutralized, defending a secret that was never really a secret, waiting for a decision that kept not coming. R.V. Jones, who had argued for immediate deployment, never forgot those losses. In his memoirs, written decades later, he described his frustration at watching the debate drag on while the casualty lists grew longer. The bureaucratic caution that seemed so reasonable in committee meetings translated directly into coffins and memorial services and telegrams to grieving families. The German reaction to Window was everything British planners had feared and nothing they had predicted. Within hours of the first Hamburg raid, Luftwaffe intelligence understood exactly what had happened. German scientists had been expecting this. Their own duple development meant they recognized the countermeasure immediately. There was no secret to steal. The British had simply been first to use what both sides already possessed. The immediate German response was tactical adaptation. Ground controllers developed new methods for tracking the bomber stream by identifying where the chaff clouds were densest. Night fighter pilots learned to orbit over burning cities, using the fires as illumination to spot bombers visually. New radar sets operating on different frequencies proved partially resistant to Window. The defensive system was wounded but not destroyed. But the deeper German response was strategic despair. General Adolf Galland, commander of Luftwaffe fighters, described the Hamburg raids as a catastrophe. Hermann Göring, who had promised Hitler that no enemy bomb would ever fall on German cities, fell into one of his periodic depressions. The Kammhuber Line, which had seemed so formidable, had been revealed as vulnerable to a countermeasure costing almost nothing. The Germans never deployed their own duple effectively against Britain. By 1943, they simply lacked the bomber force to exploit it. A few raids using metallic strips were launched in early 1944 during Operation Steinbock, the so-called Baby Blitz, but these were pinprick attacks by a handful of aircraft against a British defence that now expected and could partially counter the interference. The feared reversal never materialized. Instead, Window became a standard part of bomber command operations for the rest of the war. Crews became expert at timing their bundle releases. Special aircraft were designated as chaff dispensers, flying ahead of the main force to create maximum confusion. Refinements to the strip dimensions allowed jamming of multiple radar frequencies simultaneously. The climax came on D-Day, June 6, 1944. As Allied forces prepared to land on the beaches of Normandy, elaborate deception operations sought to convince German commanders that invasion fleets were approaching elsewhere. Aircraft flew precisely calculated patterns over the English Channel while dropping Window at carefully timed intervals. These aircraft flew racetrack patterns, each successive circuit slightly closer to the French coast, dropping bundles of chaff at exact intervals. Operation Glimmer created the radar appearance of a massive invasion fleet approaching the Pas de Calais, exploiting German beliefs that the main assault would come at the Channel's narrowest point. Operation Taxable simulated another phantom fleet heading toward Cap d'Antifer near Le Havre. The falling chaff clouds, combined with the aircraft's movement and radar-reflecting balloons, convinced German radar operators they were tracking naval convoys. Shore batteries fired at fleets that did not exist. German forces in the Pas de Calais reported invasion ships, while the real landings proceeded in Normandy. This deception demonstrated how Window had evolved from a defensive countermeasure to an offensive tool of strategic deception. The simple strips of metallic paper that had been considered too dangerous to use had become indispensable to the largest amphibious invasion in history. The legacy of Window extends far beyond the Second World War. The principle of radar jamming through dispersed reflectors became a fundamental element of electronic warfare. Modern military aircraft carry chaff dispensers as standard defensive equipment. The metallic strips have evolved into precisely engineered filaments of metallized glass fiber, but the basic concept remains unchanged from Joan Curran's original design. More broadly, the Window controversy established precedents for how military establishments think about disruptive technologies. The fear that using a new weapon will teach enemies how to counter your own defenses became a recurring theme of Cold War planning. Nuclear strategy, missile defense, electronic warfare, all would be shaped by the same dilemma that paralyzed the Window debate, when both sides have access to the same physics. When any weapon used against the enemy can be turned against you, how do you decide when to strike first? The atomic scientists who built the first nuclear weapons faced exactly this calculation. So did the strategists who planned mutual, assured destruction. So do the cybersecurity experts wrestling with offensive and defensive uses of the same vulnerabilities. The ghost of the Window debate haunts every discussion of revolutionary military technology. Documents related to the Window program remained classified for decades after the war. When British archives finally released the full records, historians examining them found confirmation of what participants had long claimed. Both sides had known. Both sides had waited. Both sides had been wrong about what the other might do. The German scientists examining Window strips recovered after the Hamburg raids produced no breakthroughs. They already knew everything those strips could tell them. Their own Duppel was functionally identical. The secrecy that cost so many lives protected nothing. Today, examples of wartime chaff can be found in military museums across Britain and Germany. Small bundles of paper and aluminum foil preserved behind glass, looking exactly like what they are. Simple, obvious, almost trivial. But those fragile strips changed the air war over Europe. They blinded radar systems that had been killing bomber crews by the thousands. They enabled the destruction of Hamburg and helped secure the D-Day beaches. They demonstrated that in technological warfare, the simplest solutions can be the most powerful. The German radar operators who watched their screens fill with chaos on the night of July 24, 1943, were witnessing something they should have expected. Their own scientists had warned them this was possible. Their own technology could have done the same thing to British radar years earlier. Both sides had held weapons capable of transforming the air war, and both sides had been too afraid to use them. In the end, it took Winston Churchill to break the stalemate. His authorization of Window came nearly 2 years after the technology was proven. During those 2 years, the Kammhuber Line continued claiming victims. Night fighters continued finding bombers in the darkness. Crews continued dying in numbers that might have been prevented. The tinfoil strips that fluttered down over Hamburg that July night cost perhaps a few pounds to manufacture for the entire raid. The lives they saved were beyond calculation. The lives lost during the years of waiting were beyond forgiveness. Because in the shadow war of radar and counter-radar that determined who lived and died over Europe, the most powerful weapon was not a new bomb or a faster aircraft. It was strips of aluminum foil falling through the darkness, filling enemy screens with ghosts. And the greatest failure was not technological, but human. The failure to use what was already known. The failure to act on what was already understood. The failure of imagination that kept a simple solution locked away, while the complicated problem kept killing young men night after night. Window worked because radar had a weakness that physics made inevitable. But the real lesson of Window was about human weakness, the paralysis that comes from fearing what enemies might do, the caution that calculates risks while ignoring costs, the secrecy that protects nothing while sacrificing everything. Those aluminum strips falling through the night sky over Hamburg did not just blind German radar, they illuminated something about war itself, that the weapons which matter most are often the ones we already have, that the secrets we guard most carefully are often secrets our enemies already know, that the courage to act matters more than the cleverness to invent. The crews who flew that first Window mission did not know if the strips would work. They did not know if German fighters would somehow penetrate the interference. They knew only that something was being tried, something different, something that might give them a chance to survive. 12 aircraft lost from nearly 800. 1.5% instead of 6%. Hundreds of young men who came home that morning instead of burning in the wreckage of their bombers over Germany. That was the measure of what a few bundles of paper and foil could accomplish when someone finally decided to use them. And that was the measure of what the years of waiting had cost.